Do you have freedom? In essence, are you allowed to be you? Do you have the quality or state of being free? The power to do as one pleases, freedom from physical restraint, freedom from arbitrary or despotic control, the power of choice? Are you sovereign? That is the liberty mindset. Let us foster our curiosity and seek the truth. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Liberty Mindset. Yeah, my lighting is a little off today, but I don't think lighting can help this face all that much. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 4 from this week. I'm going to try to actually look at the camera. Chapter 4 from The Planned Chaos. This is by Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises was a 20th century economist out of the Austrian School of Economics, and he wrote quite a bit in the mostly the mid 20th century, 1930s to 1950s, 60s, and he's actually has a real influence on the Libertarian Party. There is a group of them now called the Mises Caucus, and they premise that their economics stem from his work. Martin Friedman uses him a lot. There's other modern economics. A few of them actually refer back to Mises as a source material. Today, we're talking about Russia's aggressiveness. Now, remember, this book was written in 1947 the first time, and then I'm reading the revised version from 1949. Mises lived through World War I and II. He saw how things worked, and he comments on how the economics changed. So, Chapter 4, Russia's aggressiveness. The German, Italian, and Japanese nationalists justified their aggressive policies by their lack of Lebensraum. Their country, Lebensraum, I think that's French. Their countries are comparatively overpopulated. They are poorly endowed by nature and depend on the import of foodstuffs and raw materials from abroad. They must export manufacturers to pay for these badly needed imports. But the protectionist policies expounded by these countries producing a surplus of foodstuffs and raw materials closed their frontiers to import of manufacturers. The world is manifestly tending towards a state of full economic autarky of each nation, in which what fate is in store for those nations who can neither feed nor clothe their citizens out of domestic resources. The Lebensraum doctrine of the self-styled have-not people emphasizes that there are in America and in Australia millions of acres of unused land, land much more fertile than the barren soil of which the farmers that have not nations are tilling. I'm sorry, I'm reading it in the wrong place. I apparently need to do something different. So give me half a second while I figure this out. See if I can do this way. Hopefully you can still hear me. The farmers that have not nations are tilling. Natural conditions for mining and manufacturing are likewise much more propitious than in the countries of the have-nots. But the German, Italian, and Japanese peasants and workers are barred from the access of these areas favored by nature. The immigration laws of the comparatively underpopulated countries prevent their migration. These laws raise the marginal productivity of labor and thereby wage rates in the underpopulated countries and lower them in the overpopulated countries. The high standard of living in the United States and the British dominions is paid for by a lowering of the standard of living in the congested countries of Europe and Asia. The true aggressors say these German, Italian, and Japanese nationalists are those nations who, by means of trade and migration barriers, have arrogated to themselves the lion's share of the natural riches of the earth. Has not the Pope himself declared the root causes of the world wars are that cold, quote, that cold and calculating egoism which tends to hoard the economic resources and materials destined for the use of all such an extent of the nation, which tends to hoard the economic resources and materials destined for those of use of all such an extent that the nations less favored by nature are not permitted to access them. The war that Hitler, that was footnote 18 if you want to read it up in the book. The war of the Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito kindled was from the point of view, from their point of view, a just war, for its only aim was to give to the have-nots what, by virtue of natural and divine right, belongs to them. The Russians cannot venture to justify their aggressive policies by such arguments. Russia is comparatively underpopulated country. Its soil is much better endowed by nature than any of the other countries. It offers the most advantageous conditions for the growing of all kinds of cereals, fruits, seeds, plants, and Russia owns immense pastures and almost inexhaustible forests. It has the richest resources for the production of gold, silver, platinum, iron, copper, nickel, manganese, and all other metals, and of oil. But for the despotism of the czars and the lamentable inadequacy of the communist system, its population could long since have enjoyed the highest standard of living. It is certainly not a lack of natural resources that pushes Russia towards conquest. Lenin's aggressiveness was an outgrowth of his conviction that he was the leader of the final world revolution. He considered himself as the legitimate successor of the First International, destined to accomplish the task of which Marx and Engels had failed. The knell of capitalism had sounded, and no capitalist machinations could delay the expropriation of the expropriators any longer. What was needed was only the dictator of a new social order. Lenin was ready to take the burden upon his shoulders. Since the days of the Mongol invasion, mankind has not had to face such an unflinching and thoroughgoing aspiration for unlimited world supremacy. In every country, the Russian emissaries and the communist fifth column were frantically working for the Anschluss to Russia. But Lenin backed the first four columns. Russia's military forces were at that time contemptible. When they crossed the Russian borders, they were stopped by the Poles. They could not march further west. The great campaign for world conquest petered out. It was just idle talk to discuss the problems whether communism in one country only is possible or desirable. The communists had failed utterly outside the Russian frontiers. They were forced to stay home. Stalin devoted all his energy to the organization of a standing army of a size the world had never seen before. But he was not more successful than Lenin and Trotsky had been. The Nazis easily defeated this army and occupied the most important part of Russia's territory. Russia was saved by the British and, above all, by the American forces. American Lend-Lease enabled the Russians to follow on the heels of the Germans when the scarcity of equipment and threatening American invasion forced them to withdraw from Russia. They could even occasionally defeat the rear guards of the retreating Nazis. They could conquer Berlin and Vienna when the American airplanes had smashed the German defenses. When the Americans had crushed the Japanese, the Russians could quietly stab them in the back. Of course, the communists inside and outside of Russia and the fellow travelers passionately contended that it was Russia that had defeated the Nazis and liberated Europe. They pass over in silence the fact that the only reason the Nazis could not capture Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad was their lack of munitions, airplanes, and gasoline. It was the blockade that made it possible for the Nazis to provide their armies with the equipment needed, and to construct in the occupied Russian territory a transport system that could ship the equipment to far distant front lines. The decisive battle of the war was a battle of the Atlantic. The great strategical events of the war against Germany were the conquest of Africa and Sicily and the victory in Normandy. Stalingrad was, when measured by the gigantic standard of this war, hardly more than a tactical success. In the struggle against the Italians and the Japanese, Russia's share was nil. But the spoils of the victory go to Russia alone. While the other United Nations did not seek for territorial aggrandizement, the Russians are in full swing. They have annexed the 3 Baltic republics, Bessarabia, Czechoslovakia's province of Carpatho-Russia, a part of Finland, a great part of Poland, and a huge territories in the Far East. They claim the rest of Poland, Romania, and Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Korea, and China as their exclusive sphere of influence. They are anxious to establish in these countries friendly governments, i.e. puppet governments, but for the opposition raised by the United States and Great Britain would rule today in the whole of the continental Europe, continental Asia, and northern Africa. Only the American and British garrisons in Germany bar the Russians away to the shores of the Atlantic. Today, no less than after the First World War, the real menace for the West does not lie in the military power of Russia. Great Britain could easily repel a Russian attack, and it would be sheer lunacy for the Russians to undertake war against the United States, not the Russian armies, but the communists. Ideologies threaten the West. The Russians know it very well and place confidence not in their own army, but in the foreign partisans. They want to overthrow the democracies from within, not from without. Their main weapon is the pro-Russian machinations of their fifth columns. These are the crack divisions for the Bolshevism. The communist writers and politicians inside and outside Russia explain Russia's aggressive policies as mere self-defense. It is, they say, not Russia that plans aggression, but on the contrary, the decaying capitalist democracies. Russia wants merely to defend its own independence. This is an old and well-tried method of justifying aggression. Louis XIV and Napoleon I, Wilhelm II, and Hitler were the most peace-loving of all men. When they invaded foreign countries, they did so only in just self-defense. Russia was as much menaced by Estonia or Latvia as Germany was by Luxembourg or Denmark. An outgrowth of this fable of self-defense is the legend of the cordon sanitaire, the political independence of the small neighbor countries of Russia. Is nearly a capitalist makeshift designed to prevent the European democracies from being infected with the germ of communism. Hence, it is concluded these small nations have forfeited their right to independence. For Russia has the inalienable right to claim that its neighbors, and likewise its neighbors' neighbors, should only be ruled by, quote, friendly, end quote, i.e. strictly communist governments. What would happen if all great powers were to make the same pretension? The truth is that it is not the governments of the democratic nations that aim to overthrow the present Russian system. They do not foster pro-democratic columns in Russia, and they do not incite the Russian masses against their rulers. But the Russians are a busy day and night fomenting unrest in every country. The very lame and hesitant intervention of the Allied nations in the Russian Civil War was not a pro-capitalist and anti-communist venture. For the Allied nations involved there struggled for life and death with the Germans. Lenin was at that time merely a tool of their deadly foes. Ludendorff had dispatched Lenin to Russia in order to overthrow the Kerensky regime and to bring about the defection of Russia. The Bolsheviks fought by force of arms all those Russians who wanted to continue the alliance with France, Great Britain, and the United States. From a military point of view, it was impossible for the Western nations to stay neutral while their Russian allies were desperately defending themselves against the Bolsheviks. For the Allied nations, the Eastern Front was at stake. The cause of the white generals was their own cause. As soon as the war against Germany came to an end in 1918, the Allies lost interest in Russian affairs. There was no longer any need for an Eastern Front. They did not care a whit about the internal problems of Russia. They longed for peace and were anxious to withdraw from the fighting. They were, of course, embarrassed because they did not know how the liquidation of their venture with propriety. Their generals were ashamed and abandoning companions in arms who had fought to the best of their abilities in common cause. To leave these men in the lurch was, in their opinion, nothing short of cowardice and desertion. Such a consideration of military honor delayed for some time the withdrawal of the inconsequentious Allied detachments and the termination of deliveries to the whites, the Russian whites, the white Russians. When this was finally accomplished, the Allied statesmen felt relief. From then on, they adopted a policy of strict neutrality with regard to Russian affairs. It was very unfortunate indeed that the Allied nations had been willy-nilly exchanged the Russian Civil War. It would have been better if the military situation of 1917 and 18 had not compelled them to interfere. But one must not overlook the fact that the abandonment of interventionism in Russia was tantamount to the final failure of President Wilson's policy. The United States had entered the war in order to make the world safe for democracy. The victory had crushed the Kaiser and substituted in Germany a republican government for the comparatively mild and limited imperial autocracy. On the other hand, it had resulted in Russia in establishing a dictatorship compared with which the despotism of the czars could be called liberal. But the Allies were not eager to make Russia safe for democracy as they had tried to do with Germany. After all, the Kaiser's Germany had parliaments, ministers, responsibilities of the parliaments, trial by jury, freedoms of thought and of religion, of the press, and much more limited than in the West, and many other democratic institutions. But Soviet Russia was an unlimited despotism. The Americans, the French, and the British failed to see that failed to see things from this angle. But the anti-democratic forces in Germany, Italy, Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans thought differently. As the nationalists of these countries interpreted it, the neutrality of the Allied powers with regard to Russia was evidence of the fact that their concern for democracy had been a mere blind. The Allies, they argued, had fought Germany because they envied Germany's economic prosperity, and they spared the new Russian autocracy. Because they were not afraid of Russian economic power, democracy, the then nationalists concluded, was nothing else than a convenient catchword to delude gullible people, and they became frightened that the emotional appeal of this slogan would one day be used as a disguise for insidious assaults against their own independence. Since the abandonment of the intervention, Russia had certainly no longer any reason to fear the great Western powers, neither were the Soviets afraid of a Nazi aggression. The assertions to the contrary, very popular in Western Europe and in America, resulted from the complete ignorance of German affairs. But the Russians knew Germany and the Nazis. They had read Mein Kampf. They'd learned from this book not only what Hitler coveted the Ukraine, but also that Hitler's fundamental strategical idea was to embark upon the conquest of Russia only after having definitely and forever annihilated France. The Russians were fully convinced that Hitler's expectation, as expressed in Mein Kampf, that Great Britain and the United States would keep out of this war and would quietly let France be destroyed, was vain. They were certain that such a new world war, in which they themselves planned to stay neutral, would result in a new German defeat. And this defeat, they argued, would make Germany, if not the whole of Europe, safe for Bolshevism. Guided by this opinion, Stalin, already in the time of the Weimar Republic, aided the then secret German rearmament. The German communists helped the Nazis as much as they could in their endeavors to undermine the Weimar regime. Finally, Stalin entered into August 1939 into an open alliance with Hitler in order to give him a free hand against the West. What Stalin, like other people, did not anticipate was the overwhelming success of the German armies in 1940. Hitler attacked Russia in 1941 because he was fully convinced that not only France but also Great Britain was done for, and that the United States, menaced in the near rear by Japan, would not be strong enough to interfere successfully with the European affairs. The disintegration of the Habsburg Empire in 1918 and the Nazis' defeat in 1945 have opened the gates of Europe to Russia. Russia is today the only military power on the European continent, but they are the Russians so intent upon conquering and But why are the Russians so intent upon conquering and annexing? They certainly do not need the resources of these countries. Neither is Stalin driven by the idea that such a conquest could increase his popularity with the Russian masses. His subjects are indifferent to military glory. It is not the masses whom Stalin wants to placate by his aggressive policies, but the intellectuals. For their Marxism orthodoxy is at stake, the very foundation of the Soviet might. These Russian intellectuals were narrow-minded enough to absorb modifications of the Marxian creed, which were in fact an abandonment of the essential teachings of the dialectical materialism, provided that these modifications flattered their Russian chauvinism. They swallowed the doctrine that Holy Russia could skip one of these inexorable stages of economic evolution as described by Marx. They prided themselves on being the vanguard of the proletariat and the world revolution, who, by realizing socialism was first in one country only, set up a glorious example for all other nations. But it is impossible to explain to them why the other nations do not finally catch up with Russia. In the writings of Marx and Engels, which one cannot keep out of their hands, they discovered that the fathers of Marxism considered Great Britain and France and even Germany as countries most advanced in civilization and in the evolution of capitalism. These students of Marxian universities may be too dull to comprehend the philosophical and economic doctrines of the Marxian gospel, but they are not too dull to see that Marx considered those Western countries as much more advanced than Russia. Then some of their students of economic policies and statistics began to suspect that the standard of living in the masses is much higher in the capitalist countries than in their own country. How can that be? Why are conditions much more propitious in the United States, which, although foremost in capitalist production, is most backward in awakening class consciousness to the proletarians? The interference from these facts seems inescapable. If the most advanced countries do not adopt communism and fare well under capitalism, if communism is limited to a country which Marx considers as backwards and does not bring about riches for all, is not perhaps the correct interpretation that communism is a feature of backward countries and results in general poverty? Must not a Russian patriot be ashamed of the fact that his country is committed to this system? Such thoughts are very dangerous in a despotic country. Whoever dared to express them would be mercilessly liquidated by the GPU. But even unspoken, they are on the tip of every intellectual man's tongue. They trouble the sleep of the supreme officials and perhaps even that of the great dictator. He certainly has the power to crush every opponent, but considerations of expediency make it inadvisable to eradicate all somewhat judicious people and to run the country only with stupid blockheads. Tell me what you really think, Mr. Mises. This is the real crisis of Russian Marxism. Every day that passes without bringing the world revolution aggravates it. The Soviets must conquer the world, or else they are menaced by their own country, by a defection of the intelligentsia. It is a concern about ideological state of Russia's shrewdest minds that pushes Stalin's Russia's forward. Unflinching aggression. And that is the end of chapter 4. Interesting read. There's some stuff in there I wasn't quite so clear on. And this one was not so much about capitalism, but a history of the Russian. I'm going to open up calls. I see we have a caller in the queue. Brady, if you unmute, you should be able to talk. And
hello.
There you are.
Looking crispy. Very nice presentation.
Now I'm working on it.
Yeah, both the visual and the audio front. The actual show is very cool. Planned Chaos by Ludwig von Mises. This is from a book or an article?
A book. Well, it was really a group of essays that he wrote in 1947 and 1949. He has several books out. von Mises is is an economist from the Austrian School of Economy. He ran from Austria to the United States in 1939 when Hitler started doing his thing, and he's considered the founding father. Sort of. Well, his principles are the founding principles of the Mises Caucus of the Libertarian Party. His views on capitalism. He has a view on capitalism that capitalism is actually a natural state versus the other methods used by the Nazis, etc.
Uh-huh. I halfway agree with him, you know. I believe that capitalism is a natural thing that arises, but I also believe that socialism and communism are natural things that arises. I think they're all very good ideas that have just been failed. They've just failed to be implemented perfectly by humans. So I think it's really the human aspect of these ideas that kind of ruins them, not so much the idea themselves. I think that sometimes it's good to be capitalist, sometimes it's good to be communist. And it's totally dependent on the context, and you got to be flexible going back and forth. That's my philosophy.
Okay.
But this is a great show, man, and I appreciate it. I'm gonna pass the joint and just say good job, man, and looking forward to more of these.
All right. Well, Tokan, I'm doing this. This in particular project has got about 5 or 6 more episodes. Where I'm going to be completing this book, and you can also catch us on Spotify at the Liberty Mindset. Spotify, Apple, Google podcasts, where all of these are posted later. So if you want to catch up, you can listen to those previous episodes there. Thank you. And let's take Lance.
How you doing, Gregor?
Good, Lance. How are you, my friend?
Oh, just fine, thanks. Yeah, so in my little bubble there, you know, what is it, radical, heterodox, populist, whatever, anti-ismist, you know, definitely more and more politically. And the only ism I'm interested in, we're all organisms. That unites us. We're all organisms. That's the only ism I'm really interested in, right? So, yeah, I guess ultimately, you know, knowing maybe a couple of pages, I know the gist of it. I'm not an intellectual, but I like to think I'm relatively intelligent. Anarcho-syndicalism, I just think, you know, is a way to go. Being a populist is kind of the ultimate populism. You start out with the people around you and build up from there. Create governments as big as you need. You know, and so, yeah, I got to look at this guy. I've heard of him. I think I've read like a very, very but I got to look into him because he's very interesting. You know, I've heard of his name, and like I said, I've read a sketch here and there about him.
His history is fascinating, and this is the first book I may do more of his work because I'm really enjoying it. I've also got one of Friedman's books that I'm going to be starting, just to round out my brain. I don't know. I don't think I can read online for copyright reasons, but I might sort of do a book club episode where we go over chapters or something. You know, it part of me is struggling with this, you know, our current societal thing. You know, Brady's interestingly enough, back in line, but, you know, Brady talked about both having a thing for one needed socialism, one needed capitalism. And I don't disagree that humanity is the biggest enemy of all the isms. And I'm not a big fan of saying this is the only ism that is correct. But one of the things I'm in my studies of our founding fathers, et cetera, they were meant to be is for each individual to be their own ism. You know, each person was supposed to have their own set of freedoms, and the entire purpose of the government was to protect the rights of those individuals, that individual sovereignty, which we've far exceeded going the other way by regulating everything into the nth degree and trying to make nobody responsible for anything. And, you know, and to me, that's part of our failure, is that people see that they have to be protected by the government instead of understanding that they have to take control of their own future.
Yeah, but I think we get off track right literally from the very start.
Well, you're human, and we're going to always get off track. I can't disagree with that. But
but I mean, in terms of how we define terms, the idea that it's a complete contradiction to say that government is there to ensure our freedom. No, it's government by definition, whether it's a dictatorship, a monarchy, a true democratic, full democracy, democratic republican, doesn't matter. democratic republic, the government by definition means you to control, to stop people from doing bad shit. That's all it means. In other words, in a steam engine, and it's the same route, it's the same principle, right? So when you put your train running a little slow back in the day, and you got to pilot with coal, well, you don't want all that energy to make the train go 100 miles an hour. You got to have a governor, right, that controls that steam and says only allows just exactly what you need, keeps it on an even keel. Okay, so too much energy, too much power, in the hand. So that's what governments do. Governments are specifically invented by anybody, regardless of the type of government, to restrict freedom.
Well, that is the current goal of government. And having said that, if you read what our founding fathers wrote from themselves, the purpose of government was to just create an environment where people could act on their own.
Yeah, but you're saying current. No, I'm saying that every government since ancient Egypt, feudal Europe.
Well, I'm talking
Roman
about
Empire,
what. I mean, absolutely, what you're saying is not.
Wait a minute. Can I say this? When societies get too many people in too small a place and start fucking with each other too much, that's why governments happen. No, I think you're just completely defining the term government. Governments are there to restrict freedom. That's all they do. That's what government, that's not all they do, but that's the whole principle of why governments crop up when you have too many people fucking with each other. It's not because everybody's getting along great and let's figure out a way to get along better. No, it's because we need to restrict the movements and the actions and the policies and whatever is going on. That's what governments do. So no, it's a misnomer to say that government's all about freedom. No, it's about restricting freedom. That's the essential start point. That's the starting point of what governments do. You can't argue against that as far as I'm concerned, because it's the definition, unless you want to change and rewrite Webster.
Well, Webster is rewritten on a daily basis, and I have a real challenge with the fact that we do that with our language.
Okay, so you really are going to say that. Your argument is that the idea that that's what governments have been since day one to now. Now we're going to have a whole new thing.
No,
government's about
stop.
freedom.
You're putting words in my hold it. You're putting words in my mouth. You're putting words in my mouth. Okay, that is not what I said. What I said, the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution that established in 1791 after the 10 Amendments, the purpose of that was to give human sovereignty, and the purpose of the Constitution was to restrict government from inhibiting rights. That was its purpose. That's what it was stated its purpose was for. It was said that the government protects these 10 rights so that you have all the rest. Okay? That's what it was originally intended for. Okay. Now, the rest of the governments, we agree. Okay. Governments are always oppressive. Even the United States government in its current form is oppressive. What I was saying was that our founding fathers' purpose was to establish the rules by which society, the few rules at which society would work, and that was to protect the individual rights. All of that's gone away now. It started going away in 1801 or sooner. Okay, I mean, as soon as we established it, it started being walked away from because humans are involved and somebody wants to be in charge.
Well, again, you realize that the 10 amendments that gave us all those individual rights, they would have passed it, those 55 guys. The people said, no fucking way. We want rights. So they were forced already by the populace to put the amendments. They were added on because we weren't having it. So the fact that we have any of the 10 amendments written into the law instead of gleaning it from the English common law or something, So again, I just think that we're talking past each other here, because I don't think we're even under. And you say it's like oppressive. Well, it's oppressive in the same sense that if you have a society, let's say just a place, do whatever. You have 100 people that happen to live in a certain area, and one guy's going around and burning houses, but another guy, because he don't want to work like everybody else does, and he wants to steal shit, you have to oppress that. That's what governments do. So you can call it oppressive, yeah. And governments always become too oppressive. I'm a populist. I want anarcho-syndicalism. I don't want governments. I'm an anarchist. But the idea of, and even that, you got to have some way to have everybody on the same page of what you're going to allow or disallow.
Well, you can't be an anarchist if you want everybody on the same page.
No, I'm just trying to define the terms. I'm saying that anarchy means I don't want government. But to say that I don't want government doesn't mean that I'm going to redefine what government is. Government, by definition, Hobbesian, it's like to stop people from doing, it's to oppress people. It's to stop people from doing stuff that society decided we don't want them to do. It's not about freedom. So freedom is something that even in the original Constitution came as an amendment later. We didn't even have that. So no, it's not like freedom. It was any part of the Constitution until it had to be amended.
No.
That's demonstrably false what you're saying.
I would say it's demonstrably actually not false, because the premise of the Constitution we find in the original letters we sent to the king, including the Declaration of Independence, which its purpose was, we tried a very soft government with like no rules for 20 years before we established the current Constitution. We have to understand this, is that the revolution, that the what we call the first Civil War in the 1860s was actually the second Civil War. The first one is when we went from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution, and that was done.
Yeah, and then they staged a coup. They staged a coup against the states, and they said, "Okay, state, we're going to go and tweak the Articles of Confederation." They locked everybody out, closed the windows. I lived in Philly; it's hot. Yeah, back then it was hotter.
Okay, and that was a hot, exceptionally hot summer.
You know what
too.
we did? Can I make this last point? So they said, "No, we did a whole federal government," and somebody made a very interesting analysis that says the Constitution is a very short document. Every comma, every punctuation was debated. Instead of "we the several states," they debated this. "We the states of," and then listing the third. No, "we the people." That was designed to make it a federalist top down. People think "we the people," isn't that great? No, it meant it's going to be a federalism. We were 13 sovereign states. So technically, when the government of England was overthrown, the Articles of Confederation became in full force. What those guys at the Constitution Hall did, they staged a coup against the existing government and forced, as aristocrats, the government that they chose, which was a federalist government, on the people. Read the anti-federalist papers. You'd love it if as a libertarian type.
Well, I have read them, and
by Ketchum, the guy from his name's Ralph Ketchum from Syracuse University. Yeah. Great book.
Okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate it, Lance. I'm not going to argue with you, because I don't think we can. I think we're having a definition of terms here. And I don't disagree with you that all governments, including our own, are there for the oppression. The interesting thing is if you want to live under a free society, everyone acknowledges you have to have these X number of rules, but yet everybody wants to enforce them in different ways that, always because humans are involved, only become oppressive. And, I acknowledge that has happened here without question.
My last thing. Forget Milton Friedman. He's a crank. But did you read Adam Smith? I'm going to read Wealth of Nations, because I haven't read it, but I'm going to read it. I think that's crucial, because he understood the power that rich people would hold over people. They were not like, "Hey, yeah, monopoly. One guy gets it all." No, he knew that it was horrible. So look, half of Adam Smith sounds like Richard Wolff. I'm telling you.
He said Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations.
In 1776, the same year. By the way, the Declaration of Independence.
I'll look it up.
Was aspirin.
I have not read that, and I will look it up. Thank you.
Oh, you got to read Wealth of Nathan. Oh my God, he makes, and this is like a conservative. Adam Smith is the godfather of conservative economics. Okay, a conservative economics would say Milton Friedman is like third grade compared to Adam Smith. Adam Smith is the guy.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
All right, thank you. Cool. Does anybody else want to come play? I got some time here, and we've had an interesting discussion. Since you're still here, Lance, do you believe that? Do you understand, or what is your what do you think capitalism is? Is it something that's completely agricultural, meaning that it's natural, or is it something is it a made up term?
No, capitalism was invented. That's just demonstrably true. They said, look, it's not good to have slaves, so let's pay people. And it was well made, by the way, considering that there was people that understood exactly what the fucking aristocrats were doing, these Enlightenment guys. I think overall, the anti-federalist lost that said, no, we don't want the Constitution. New York voted against it, I think, at first, but they were, okay. So the Constitution, so I think they did relatively well. There were more rights than in any other history for a democratic republic. They had a little more republic, a little less democracy than other people were arguing for at the time. But here's the thing. Capitalism is an invention. Society decided that corporations can be good for society, so we will allow them by law. They're called charters. You have to have a board of directors. You have to have quarterly report, all that stuff.
Whoa. That's not capitalism.
Wait, can I just finish the thought?
Okay.
Call it whatever you want. I'm talking about corporations are chartered. You are allowed to incorporate because society has decided and chosen our republic officials, the elected officials, to allow charters for corporations. Okay. Now, what I'm saying about capitalism, I want to do to capitalism what Grover Norquist wants to do to the regulatory state. I do not. Let me be emphatic. I do not want to eliminate capitalism. I just want to make it small enough so that if we wanted to, we could drown it in a tub and it could thrive. It would thrive just fine.
Okay.
By the way,
I'll
stop with this. Scandinavia, right? They have capital. They're very capitalistic. Some of the biggest corporations in the world. Not the huge maybe, but are in Sweden and Norway. Norway, are you kidding me? Now, they're not always so wonderful in terms of what they're doing with the pipeline and all that. I'm not saying it's utopia. But democratic socialism of the kind up there, there's plenty of capitalism because you do get innovation. But let me tell you what America did. After the robber baron era, unless they were hanging on like maybe a Howard Hughes, and even a little bit after that, until the 70s, we didn't mint any billionaires because we passed laws preventing it by saying 90% tax rate. Now go ahead and write it off, expense account, but you're going to start with a 90% rate instead of a 20% rate. All that shit happened. We really did it. We taxed people so fucking heavily after $110, $20 million, it became disincentivized to make more money. We did it with laws. It isn't by natural. So I don't want capitalism to lose all the innovation. And I don't want to be in a socialist state that says you got to be part of the party and I can't have free speech libertarianism and say, fuck this capitalism, socialism stuff. I want to go back to full capitalism. I want people to be able to have that right. Okay, so I have a very strong libertarian streak. Okay, but capitalism, like in Scandinavia, it can do just fine. But no, we have to put the boot on the neck because we only allowed corporations by law because they help society. The minute they stop helping society, we have the same right to take their charters away.
Okay, and there again, we're having a definition problem because capitalism, by the definition that I'm using, is actually just the exchange of products and services.
I'm talking about corporations.
Can I please? This is my turn now. Thank you.
Corporations.
This is my turn now. Thank you. Okay. The capitalism you described, where corporations who are involved with the federal government, the kind like they have in Sweden, is not capitalism by any definition. That was the point I was trying to get to. Capitalism is the free exchange between individuals, products and services. Thank you very much for coming, Lance. Whew, sorry about that. But definition is really important. And one of the things we covered in the first couple of chapters of Van Mises' books was what the definition of capitalism we'd be using in this discussion would be. And when the point is, and that so far the point of Van Mises' writings at all has been, as soon as you involve the government in regulating, controlling, optimizing anything to do with the free exchange of goods between people, you no longer have capitalism. Capitalism will spring up on its own. It'll turn into a black market. It will turn into a free organization between two people. That is capitalism that I am talking about. What we call capitalism today is truly, granted, a big lie because corporations are made or broken based on federal reaction, and that is not a free market. That is a controlled market. That is the same market that the Nazis used. And that is not capitalism. That is actually, could be more better defined as fascism. And yes, I am saying America is currently a fascist state. Maybe not a fascist nationalistic state like Germany, where everybody had to be a purebred and had to, Germany was to be in charge of everything. Though one would, based on our current actions, you would think that maybe the United States is thinking that way under the current administration. Anyway, anybody else want to come and play? Because if not, I'm not going to sit here and talk about what the rights and wrongs of capitalism are. We're going through capitalism in this book in the Mises Caucus, or Ludwig von Mises, talking about what he defined as capitalism. He saw a transition from actual capitalism into what we call what I would call the interventionist capitalism that we have today. His words. All right, Brady, sure. Come play.
So I'm starting my own political party based on kind of my idea of the flexibility between capitalism and communism, called the Party.
I'm sorry. Hold on. You blanked out just when you said the party. Could you say the name of the party again?
The Proxy Party.
Proxy Party. Okay.
And the idea is to serve as a proxy government that essentially takes the tax system and makes it completely voluntary. This way, taxes will be, or campaign contributions to the proxy party will be allocated exactly as if they were taxes, completely as democratically as possible and as transparently as possible. And I think that would be a good way and the idea is to become so efficient at achieving mutual goals that people will want to invest in us, just like the stock market, because they see the real life impact that we're having on their lives. And the idea is just to make it completely voluntary and to be so good at what we do that people will want to donate. Okay. Not spending any money on advertising or merch.
All right. Do you have any websites or anything like that so people can find out information?
Yeah, just the Substack with a basic outline for the platform. It's something I've been working on loosely since 2016.
Okay.
And then more so now that they're flirting with the idea of Donald Trump and Joe Biden going at it again. I'm like, oh no, we got to dust this idea off the shelf and bring it back to life. And it's not just me working on this. There's a guy named Peter Monnier, I think. And he came up with an idea called the Proxy Party back in 2020 himself. And he really laid out, I think he wrote a book called Upgrading Democracy. And his article is at the very beginning of this platform, which I'm going to share right now. And he goes over a parliamentarian model of how this could work and kind of goes over some of the nitty gritty about the voting process, kind of the minutia involved in party making, you know. So a lot of the heavy lifting really done by him. And of course, this is all open to reinterpretation. There's things that are probably missing from it. There's things that can probably be taken out of it.
Sure.
So it's just an ever evolving list of a kind of a core group of ideas that we think are good.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I will take a look at that. And who knows, maybe even you and I can talk, schedule a talk down or something about it in sometime in the future.
Much appreciated, man. Very cool show. Looking forward to the next one.
All right. You have a good day. I'm going to call it quits here unless there's anybody else. So if not, listen, everybody, don't forget, out there in the world, it's a frightening place. So don't forget to seek the truth and stay curious. Thank you for joining us at the Liberty Mindset. Freedom is a state of being, and liberty is a state of mind. So stay curious and seek the truth.